Hi, this is Paul, and part of the reason to go to ARC is to make new friends. And this is a guy that I met quite early on. He participated in estuary, and even he and his wife joined us at the lovely dinner that our own Harris, also known as Upcycle, hosted in the Hilton near where we stayed. And this is Father Matthew Brown of which part of the Orthodox Church are you ordained in?
The OCA, so Orthodox Church in America.
Okay, OCA. Okay. I I have I have a great deal of understanding for how so many people try to deal with Protestantism because you're exactly what little thing and so trying to get
Yeah,
that
yeah,
set. So
yeah,
Matthew, thank you so much for being willing to come on and have this chat and introduce yourself and tell a bit of your story.
yeah. Thanks, Paul. Look forward
So,
to
well,
it.
let's start with you. Tell me about the home you grew up in.
Yeah, I grew up in Michigan, so in the Midwest, so sort of like rural suburban kind of area. Both I came from both my parents, were married and still are married, and I had one sister. Um, and so I was born in 1982, so sort of like 80s and 90s was sort of when I was growing up. Um, The town I grew up in was a pretty religious town, right? There was like a very large Free Methodist church, which, isn't a particular kind of this denomination similar to sort of like Nazarenes or Wesleyans, right? There's sort of this Methodist holiness tradition, maybe a little bit lower church than United Methodist, than people would sort of encounter there. So
I
that's sort of
I never
yeah.
understood the difference between Free Methodists and United Methodists, and um,
Yeah. The Free Methodists, like the free part stands for like they sort of formed in the Civil War era. And so they
okay,
were like a heavy abolitionist movement. They were
okay,
also for like freedom of worship and also free pews. So one of the things that was going on in that time was people would pay for pews. And so richer
oh,
families would have
right.
pews like in nice places, and poorer people would be like in the balcony. And so there was that social stratification, and so Free Methodists were very much against that, and adopted a lot more austere practices like no dancing or no wearing jewelry and no makeup and those types of things. So in some sense, kind of going back to some of the stricter discipline character of Methodism, right, from its founding, in certain ways. Um,
But you're growing up in the late 80s and early
so
90s.
by this point, it's generic evangelicalism with a little, spice of the denominational distinctiveness that's there, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's so true of how many. I mean, that's a lot of what the Christian Reformed Church went through too in the 80s and 90s. What had been sort of it would have been distinct if you had visited a Christian Reformed church in the 60s or 70s. You would have walked in and thought, what exactly is this? And then by the 80s or 90s, you walk in, many of them, and they would be much more sort of they're blending the music, they've taken what little iconography Protestants have out of the room. So no, that's very true.
Yeah, it's very much sort of like the Willow Creek type, phenomenon and
Yep.
everything. And I was definitely my spiritual journey was very strongly formed and started right when I was probably like I was in middle school, so like my very early teens, so probably around 13, and was in the midst of a whole sort of like the 90s youth group movement,
Oh
right? It was
yeah,
like
yeah,
pretty big during that time.
yeah.
So I was at just the right age to sort of just be right in the middle of all of that.
Wow. Did your parents grow up going to church? Had they been Free Methodists or had they sort of wandered
My
around?
my mother had so my mother was a group Free Methodist, and when she was a kid, it was very different than what it was when I was a kid, right? It was
Yeah,
much
yeah.
more strict. It was very much like, well, the joke was like, um, you know, don't have premarital sex because dancing might break out,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. We've had the
right?
same joke in the CRC.
Yeah, yeah. So it definitely had that quality to it. And so she was still, like identified as a Christian and still was sort of like, connected to that denomination. But like a lot of boomers had sort of, there was some distance there, right? Because their experience growing up, they had a lot of criticisms, right? There's a lot of things about their upbringing, um, like the strictness, this sort of like be separate and not being part of the broader culture that just really didn't sit well with that generation. Um, so like my parents didn't bring us to church like when I was like a little kid, like every single Sunday. We
Mhm.
weren't there every Sunday like that. So that was not kind of we were more like several times a year kind of
Yeah,
a thing.
yeah.
Um,
So
that's
what
kind of
was
what.
your spiritual awakening in junior high like? What was that
Yeah,
about?
well, the typical sort of youth group revivalist type experience, right? Kind of a, come to Jesus moment, right? That was really powerful for me. Um, when you're that age, you're sort of looking for like, uh, especially as a young guy, right, hitting puberty and stuff, looking for identity and meaning and something like that. And so that was all definitely a huge part of it. And I had a pretty, let's say, pretty significant sort of spiritual experience very young, right? And
Mm.
I was pretty zealous very young. Um, yeah, so that was, and I look back at that now, which this is a whole interesting conversation, is when you switch traditions like that are very different, how do you reconcile and look at your path? It's sort of a New Testament, Old Testament type of
Yeah.
conversation you have to have with yourself. You know, so I still look at those experiences as genuine, right? And
Yeah.
very formative of who I was and that God was working in those. And it's interesting as you get older and you look back in your life, you're sort of like retelling your own story. You should look back at the same things and you see them in whole new ways. Sort of like when you interact with like adults as an adult who you first interacted with as a child and you
Yes.
see them in a whole different way. I mean,
Yes.
it's sometimes it's amazing, but it's also sort of like disgusting almost, right? Like right? Because you're just like, this isn't, you know. Um, I
Did you go
remember,
to public school?
I did, yeah. So this is a funny story about that. Uh my last year in college, I had finished my credits up early enough that I was basically part-time my last semester, or even the last year I didn't have a full load. So I started doing substitute teaching because I had enough credits. And I ended up like going back and substitute teaching at the high school, right? So this is only like 3.5 years after I graduated. And so then I'm like in the teachers lounge and interacting with teachers who were like, there before. And that was super weird, right? It was like, oh, way more flaws, right? Like
Yeah.
way more human. Uh,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, but I went to public school.
Okay.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then graduated high school. What was your involvement in church as once you were sort of self-consciously embraced the gospel
Yeah,
and
I was sort of like
Christianity?
all in. I was like all in on it, right? I
Oh,
was there
okay.
like the Wednesday night meeting,
Yep.
like group meetings and everything. And they're on Sundays. We went on mission trips, and like went to these big youth conferences and things like that. Um,
So where did you
yeah,
go to college?
I went to a college called Spring Arbor University. So it's in the Midwest. There's a whole bunch of them in Michigan in the Midwest, all these like small liberal arts, sort of like evangelical schools. A lot of them founded in sort of like mid to like late 19th century or very early 20th century kind of era.
Yeah.
So I was in that. So like, we knew other colleges that we were like connected with were uh um like Holland College and Calvin College,
Yeah.
as well around
Yeah.
there.
Hope College in Holland.
Hope, yep, Hope.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
Yeah. Yeah.
it's like Nazarenes
Yeah.
College
Yeah. There were a
nearby
whole bunch of
too.
those, like they're Division 3 schools
Yep,
and
yep.
yep, yep. And what was your faith like in college?
Yeah, it was really, I mean, it was really strong too. Like when I was in college, um, became really good friends with who would then become my brother-in-law, right? So one of my best friends in college married my sister. Um, so that was great, and we're still great friends, you know. Like we went like 2 years ago, we went and climbed Mount Kosbeck, which is in the country of Georgia, right? We went and did some mountaineering stuff together. So like
Wow.
our families are real close. And like this past summer, we did like an out west trip, right, with my sister and her family and my brother-in-law, and we sort of did like a redo of because we did a trip like that when my sister and I were kids, so we sort of
Hmm.
like redid it, you know, with them. We're really close. But him and I in college started like a Spanish speaking, like a multilingual church plant in the city next over from us, right? So the college was sort of in a small town right outside of Jackson, Michigan,
Yep.
and we kind of went into sort of like the sort of like inner city of Jackson and sort of did this like because there wasn't any sort of like evangelical or Protestant like Spanish speaking stuff. So we went and did that. And that church is still there today. So we like as college kids kind of got that started and got some money from the denomination to do it. And you know, so that's the kind of stuff I was doing in college. And I was a philosophy and religion major. I was planning on going into ordained ministry in the Methodist Church. I had a call to ministry sort of that I felt very early on, right? In a very strong way. Um, so you know, and I really loved theology and philosophy. Like I was sort of just like this B minus student in high school. And then my senior year, I took a college course my senior year in Intro to Philosophy. And I loved it and I aced it. I got an A in it, right? You know, so that's just to say, like, there's a lot to be said for studying the things that you actually love and are interested in. You
Yeah.
know, some
Yeah.
people just don't do well because they're not interested enough in what they're working on. So
Yeah. It's also, so what year did you plant that church in Jackson?
that would have been like 2002, something like
Yeah.
that.
That's sort of that, the that church planting movement that went through evangelicalism in the 80s, 90s, and aughts, and sort of sort of really cooled off in the teens when a lot of denominations started hitting, let's say, some of the pre-woke things. And in the Christian Reformed Church, I mean, church planting was just this white hot thing. And of course, you would throw college kids, you would throw, seminarians, and I mean, the hot thing to do if you were sort of someone who was really called to ministry was go out and plant a church, and maybe that church would become like a prevailing church like Willow Creek or
Yeah,
something like
yeah.
that. And
Yeah, it was sort of like the like an entrepreneurial tech equivalent, right?
yep,
In
yep,
in the
yep,
evangelical church. The same
yeah,
of kind of similar spirit.
yeah. So you plant this church, but I mean, I didn't, when I came to Sacramento in 97, I didn't plant this church. I was called by the church that was founded here in the early 60s, but I worked with a friend of mine who had come in the early 90s who had planted his church, and we worked to help plant all these other churches here in Sacramento. And one of the things that I would always try to explain to established church people about the church planters and the church plants, that these church plants are sort of like screaming hungry babies. There's no end to the work that you can pour into a
Yeah,
church plant,
yeah.
especially if it's got like new believers in, and the amount of discipleship and the amount of fires that can sort of emerge in a church plant. Here these people came to church 6 months ago and they're all excited about it and they got baptized and they're all in, and now suddenly they're getting a divorce, and you know
Yeah,
you're just
you got to know how to roll with a lot of chaos, right? You really do. Like some people I just don't think are cut out for that kind of stuff,
so
you know.
so you guys plant this thing, but I mean, I mean, who's sort of taking care of this screaming baby? I mean, are you guys then just there continuing on, or did you go get a
We
theological
were a part
education, or
of
what
it
happened?
throughout college, and then we got like a whole bunch of other college kids together with it,
Okay.
and it grew pretty fast. Um, but it's still a pretty small thing. It's not anything that, you know, that big, but it's still going today. We sort of pass it off to other people. I'm actually surprised it actually like it was still around just because things like that you have to sort of like you have to just work so hard for so long consistently for something like
Yeah.
that to not just evaporate
Yeah.
when you leave, right?
Well, and it
Um,
makes sense if it's sort of it's kind of weird. You know how in college sometimes somebody will adopt a cat or a dog and the cat or the dog just keeps getting handed off from
well, two
one
different
college
people.
kid to another.
Yeah, yeah,
It's
yeah,
was the church plant sort of like that that here
yeah,
you
yeah.
had
It
this
was, it was, yeah. You
and
know,
sort of
there.
then the church plant sort of becomes it's this weird it's got this interesting relationship then to the college because you're going to continue to have young mission motivated evangelicals coming in there and it's like you can have a hand in pastoring and you're 20 years old and you know you're going to be on stage preaching a sermon and something like that.
Yeah, yeah, I know. Well, yeah, so it's definitely like inviting in that way. And I'm
Yeah.
sure the denomination sort of just like we didn't have hardly any money at all anyways. And
Yeah.
so they're just sort
Yeah.
of like they're just like, what can we lose? Just let these kids loose and see what they do, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah, maybe something good will happen.
Yeah.
So okay, so you're doing that and then what happens next?
Well, I sort of run into Orthodoxy while I'm in college.
Hmm.
One of my friends from high school, he was like a year older than me. And we went ended up going to the same college. His dad was the library director for the college that we went to. And so I got to know him, and he was such a really unique kind of guy. He was he was really into karate and wrote a lot of poetry, and he had converted to Orthodoxy. So he is like his whole story real quick was he grew up sort of like nominal Roman Catholic, was beat up in school in Brooklyn. You know, he grew up in Brooklyn, and then learned karate to sort of self defense. Got into the spiritual side of karate, and then got really serious and into practices like in his early adulthood, like like tantric stuff and
Yeah.
everything like that. Had an
Yeah.
encounter with some sort of like evil spirit that was really profound for him, and he was like,
Yeah.
"Oh my word, there's like personal evil, so there must be personal good." And so he went through all this process, became evangelical for a short while, and then eventually became Orthodox. And so I knew him, and I was like, man, this is a story I've never heard, right?
Yeah.
A small town evangelical world. This was like a very different world and story. And I developed a relationship with him, uh, like a mentoring relationship,
Hmm.
right? Because I was kind of looking for that. I would say that I was looking for more depth, like more of a spirituality that was more than just the typical evangelical read your Bible and pray
Hmm.
kind of thing,
Hmm.
right? And so I was looking for deeper wells, and I think that was part of developing that relationship with him was
Mm.
that sort of craving for that,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
And I mean, I don't know for sure, but I kind of think me finding orthodoxy when I did in college might have staved off some spiritual or faith crises that would have been coming over the horizon for me, like after college or something
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah.
I'm intellectual enough and questioning enough, and I'm really high in openness
Yeah.
that I feel like I would have started to have some like problems I would have started wrestling with more, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
But
and so
also I mean, if you go back in my archives, which are so many of those early Randos conversations I did with people, a lot of their meaning crisis was set up by the divorce of their parents.
hmm,
And your parents stayed together. You know, it sounds like you and I both had a fairly solid growing up. I mean, I did go to church twice on, the church was open, I was there because I was the pastor's kid. But you know, often I hear in a lot of these stories, the divorce of the parents is a foundational rupture in a lot of people.
yeah, I
And
know.
and that will then that will then, or in your friend's case, if you're getting bullied or beaten up or something like that regularly, that's gonna put you on a that's gonna send you out there looking for something, and those roadways will bring you to strange places sometimes. So, um,
Yeah.
but that
Yeah.
makes sense.
It's like, so my yeah, my parents were intact, and like my wife's family, they were like independent Baptist, and
Yep,
they're both married and still are married. So
yep,
we both came
yep,
from like uh very healthy families, and even like my parents and my in-laws, like compared to their siblings, like definitely like a lot more familial stability, right? And
yep,
health, so
yep,
on those sides.
yep.
So that what's so fascinating about that is um you don't realize how maybe that didn't used to be unique, but it definitely is now, right? Like that kind of a story. Like
Yeah,
for us to have like both me and my wife both come from, like, we're not divorced, we're married, and both of our sides of our family are married is
yeah,
like a real minority. And so like in
yeah,
my church, uh I would say at least three-quarters of the people are from like divorced families,
yep,
you
yep,
know?
yep,
And on top of that, like I think there's only one or two other families in the whole parish where both the husband and the wife are Orthodox,
yeah, yeah,
right?
yeah,
And
yep,
so it's like, oh, this puts, like, and then on top of that, our parish is like full of young people. It's probably majority under 45.
yep,
And there's the whole dating and marriage crisis and relationships things, which I try to get my head around as much as I can, but it's in some ways is very foreign to
yep,
me, right?
yep,
Where I grew up, and you can just see that, like, because we have this religion, like, oh, like us as role models and influencers in the lives of these people is like more important in certain ways that I wouldn't have expected or anticipated, right? Like
yeah,
there's a desperateness, I would say, not to try to be critical about people, but a desperateness surrounding this sort of like fear and anxiety about not being able to form relationships or not having those relationships, and sort of people's own family backgrounds sort of haunting them, right? Wherever they go. And I think that's partly what's driving a lot of young people to church, is
yeah,
that these family structures are all busted.
yeah,
And in many ways, I think the local parish, I'd say this is both a descriptive and a prescriptive thing, is functioning as an extended family unit,
yes,
right? It's
yes,
stepping in to that role, and it's just fulfilling all these functions that the family isn't fulfilling for people. And I think that's
yeah.
why a lot of people are seeking that out.
I completely agree. I was so before I was get the timing right in my head. Before ARC, I went to Ireland and I had that event with Paul Kingsnorth and Martin
Yeah,
Shaw.
yeah, yeah.
And there was this big party that we had after the event in a Catholic social hall. And one of the young guys, he was a millennial that I started talking to. He said, when I was growing up, I didn't know anyone. I didn't know anyone who was divorced or growing up in a broken home. And he said, now this is just the fracturing of Ireland that has happened. He says,
Mm,
now I don't know, with the exception of maybe one couple, I don't know anyone who either, how did he say it? Um, Basically, he didn't know anyone except for one couple who actually had children being raised with both biological parents. It's
man.
that fractured. And that change, of course, happened in Ireland. It took about 25, 30 years. And the sea change in the country just whoosh.
Yeah.
And of course, here in America, I, thinking back, most of my cousins, relatives, those marriages have stayed together. A lot of people have wandered from church. But
Mm,
in terms of at church, so many people in second or third marriages, so many people coming from broken homes. It's the contrast between a community that is made up assumedly by intact families and a community where there is so little expectation for that is just stark. And I agree with you completely that part of this is driving what I think is this new moment, at least for some in the population, of a hunger for a hunger for a family. John
Yeah,
Vervaeke talks about
and that's why I
domicile.
think this push where you're starting to was it there was it a Pew Research poll? There was a good article in New York Times like a week ago about this, how the decline of religiosity in America, which has been declining for like 40 years or so, like
Yeah,
pretty consistently and precipitously stopped,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
And the only reason it stopped was Gen Z.
yeah,
Like Gen
yeah,
Z kind of made it so it just a plateaued. I don't think that that trend is going to stop anytime soon. The trend of that younger Gen Z's generation going more religious, a little bit more traditional, right, in that direction, because and maybe other generations have a hard time appreciating it, but they grow up in a very different world than the rest of us,
oh
and
yeah,
it's like a lot of us, those who are sort of like grew up with a lot of religion and family and structure are in some ways living off the fumes of that,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
And don't realize that they have what I don't know if you call like a privilege or something like that, right? Of growing up with that. And these younger people didn't have anything from the start.
yeah,
And so there's there's a hunger and a felt need and like void
yeah.
uh in a way that's pretty powerful. That's I think it's going to keep driving people into church for community, right? As one aspect of it, right? Like, and I mean like thick community, right? Not like
Yep.
I have my friends at the CrossFit gym and or things like that, which that's good, right? That's one aspect of community, but like thick community, like I'm gonna be there when you die. I'm gonna be there when your
Yeah.
child's born. I'm gonna like those really heavy bonds that
Yeah.
people need.
But this is both opportunity and challenge for the church because, I think unlike, let's say, when I think about my parents' generation, so my parents were builders. They were born before the end of the Second World War. Both of my parents were born in the 30s. That generation stuck with church a long time, even if church let them down.
Yeah.
And I think you're right that people are looking to the church, but that's a challenge for the church that if the church stumbles with a lot of these people, they're going to continue on their desperate
And
search.
yeah, and I don't know about you, but I think I'd put my money on the church screwed it up a good bit, right? Because
Oh
that's kind of
yes.
what church does to a lot of times, right?
But the church, it's sort of like the joke with the bear. Like two guys are walking in the woods and they see a bear, and one guy says something like, that bear can run, 30 miles an hour, and the other guy says, I don't have to outrun the bear, I just have to outrun you.
Outrun you.
I
Yeah,
think I
yeah.
think part of the reason that the church still hangs around is that I see and I'm sure you see it in New York City, I see in Sacramento all kinds of other, and usually they're sort of poorly formed institutions. It might be a club or a yoga studio or something like that. And and for a while, that's sort of offering the hope to the seekers that, well, maybe this will be my family. One of the things that I talked about, one of the things that I've noted often is that part of the reason for the churches so often the church gets takes a lot of heat for its enforced demanding sexual ethic.
Hmm.
And I think, and like a lot of these other things that are sort of popping up in fashionable places for younger people in American culture, part of what they're offering is we're not putting any restraint on your sexual ethic. Yeah, but almost all of their families broke up probably because of someone's lack of, enforced, um, demanding sexual ethic. And so I think actually part of the reason that the church endures is because, yeah, we screw up a lot, but boy, I'll tell you, if you don't have an actual policed demanding sexual ethic, that thing is just going to take out your little tribe just again and again and again and again because it is just so common among human beings.
I know.
And
Well, which that's sort of like, I guess that's sort of like, this is sort of the, I mean this temperamentally, conservative approach, right? Or a traditional mindset is that you're like, hey, this thing's been passed on for so long. It must have worked for some reason, even if I don't fully understand it.
yep,
So why might that be?
yep,
And yeah, like with stuff like that, I try to take a real pragmatic approach to a lot of ethics and moral stuff. I think this is like one of my little theories. I think that something is moral or immoral whether because it works,
yeah,
right? Like, but I think it's that the morality sometimes is stretched over such a long time horizon
yep,
that it can be hard to see sort of the pragmatic, sort of like understanding that it's like, it's like, okay, well, maybe I have sex with a girl when I'm in high school or college, and it's like, what's the big deal? Or maybe I even sleep around a lot, and there's not a lot of maybe I can get by without a lot of consequences, right? And that happens a lot, right?
yep,
Um, and some people can have, sexual relationships outside of marriage that are can be quite wonderful, right? And a lot of things
yep,
that are praiseworthy about it. But the real thing is like, let's extend this beyond the individual to a whole society, and let's
yep,
extend it for like 500 years
yep.
or something, or not even that. And let's just see what happens. And it's like, well, it could lead to a fertility crisis or something like, like now, or it could lead to all kinds of other problems that you can't see unless you let it work itself out for like 3, 4, 5 generations or something. And then you start seeing, you're like, oh, this is why these are rules here, or why we have to have really strict rules in certain places, because it is in people's best interest to do that. That's how I try to frame a lot of that stuff is
Yeah.
sort of like human flourishing, kind of a pragmatic, like these things are here to like make you a stronger, better, healthier person. And it's my job to maybe try to convince people of that. So
Well, and that's part of the scramble of technology because if you're, if you're basically playing around sexually in your teens and 20s without, ubiquitous, near free effective birth control, well, we all know that story because that's been the story of most of human life, where,
yeah,
some child is going to get conceived and then you have a family crisis and people have to put their heads together. And should these two people stay together or should the family raise the child? Or,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
we've watched that. So, well, let's not get your story derailed too much.
Yep,
So
yep.
you have this friend who's Orthodox and you
Yes.
graduate from college. What happens next?
Well, I started my sort of process of looking into Orthodoxy sort of halfway through college, right?
Oh, okay.
And I sort of like after right around when I graduated, I was well, a bunch of stuff happened in college, okay? Like for like the first 2 years, I helped out with that church plant. And
Yep.
then I sort of backed away from it because I was looking into Orthodoxy and I became a catechumen and I was looking into all that stuff. And I became Orthodox in a time when it like wasn't cool. Like when you went to the church and it was like this place sucks, right? Like there's like at the church I went to uh was in a nearby town from the university. The priest was sent there. I gotta give you some of the backstory just to understand this because it's very different than people's experience with Orthodoxy today, right? The church had like 15 people. They were all over 60. He gets there, he's young, he's a new priest. Before him, the were just a bunch of fill-in priests for years. And the last permanent full-time priest sort of like apostatized right in front of everyone, like at the altar, like just after the end of liturgy came out, like took it, like basically did like a mic drop with the cross, and was just like, I'm out, folks, and just walked out and left right there in front of everybody. Yeah. So like this church, I mean, and then there's all these. This is an old church. It was an old immigrant church. It was right across the street from an old foundry, right? And so the foundry basically gave all the money to the immigrant workers to build their own church. So the church was basically built by the foundry. And they would go to like the docks and just get people off the docks in New York City and just bring them right there to work. And there's all kinds of crazy stories about like gangsters and organized crime and people shooting each other in the parish, like stuff that just you could make a mini series out of. with these immigrant communities. They were pretty wild.
Yeah.
Um, but now this church was sort of like a dying church, and the priest, Father Joshua, who was sort of the one who sort of like sort of like was my spiritual father and guide coming into the faith. He thought like maybe I'm just sent here to close this place down.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's just my ministry. I'm just going to
Yeah.
wind it down.
Yeah.
And now that church is about 250 people, and they have maybe like 50, 60, 75 kids under 18, like in
Wow.
church. Yeah, like a ton of kids. So it's like a super thriving, healthy parish now. But when I was there, it was just like other people were just kind of weird. And the people who were interested in Orthodoxy were a lot less mainstream too, even
Yeah.
then.
Yeah.
And I remember I
So
had a couple times where I'm like, doing a mental health check. Like, am I doing this because I'm having like a breakdown? Like, is something wrong? Because you sort of like, this is weird, right? So, yes.
So what attracted to, well, I mean, this guy that you had met, that certainly was a piece of it, but thinking back and just thinking about yourself, what attracted you to, because for me, there's very little that attracts me to Orthodoxy. I mean, I don't mean that in any kind of dismissive way, and I don't
Mhm.
even know what I'm saying when I say Orthodoxy, quite frankly. But when I look at sort of the liturgical practice, just doesn't,
Yeah,
I
yeah.
think in college I wouldn't have been attracted at all to it.
Yeah.
I was sort
So
of moving the other way.
I I had a little bit, not terrible, but a little bit of a hard time at the beginning with the liturgical type worship. That's not why I went there
Hmm.
initially. In some ways, I was just like, well, I'll just learn to like it, or I'll learn to understand it, and I'll just, so I sort of just stuck with it in that way. I mean, and now, like, almost 20 years down the road, that stuff like the ritual gets in your bones in a way that
Yeah,
is
yeah,
like really profound.
yeah.
And it's nice to have, I don't know. I mean, sometimes I think like American culture is very ritually illiterate, right? Like
Oh,
just,
yes.
and then when you sort of have deep ritual in your life, man, you're really grateful for it. You're like, this
Mm,
is really necessary as a human being to have
mm,
rituals that stretch across generations and like centuries.
hmm.
So I learned to like that. But like what attracted to me, one, I mean, initially it was just I was looking for greater spiritual depth. And the spirituality in Orthodoxy is, it's like the Marianas Trench, like you can go as deep as you want,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So there was that. The other one was some church history, right? Like learning, I mean, you grow up in this sort of evangelical church history, and then you sort of learn the whole story, and you sort of feel like, especially if you're younger like that, feel like, man, did someone pull the wool over my eyes? I feel like maybe I was not told the whole story. And so then you get curious, right? Um, and so I think the history, and then the other thing that really did it for me was really the theology being so rich and beautiful
Mm,
and not being compartmentalized,
mm,
right? In the way I experienced learning it in the Protestant world, it was just like there was such a continuity between different areas of theology and between the theology and practice that
hmm.
was really, I just thought, beautiful and just seemed really right. And in particular was was like the doctrines of like salvation, like soteriology, so stuff around atonement, right?
Hmm.
Because I think this is what makes a lot of people lose faith is they lose faith in atonement.
Hmm.
And by this I mean some version of penal substitutionary atonement of some
Hmm.
variety of that, and people eventually just be like, I can't believe that,
Hmm.
and because that theology is made sort of like in many cases almost the totality of the gospel.
Hmm.
If you don't buy that, then you don't buy anything, basically, is the
Hmm.
way it ends up getting framed in people's minds. And
Yeah.
so for me, running into sort of theosis, like deification and the whole
Hmm.
vision of salvation was a relief. And when I first sort of started running into it, I thought, oh, this is what I've always believed
Hmm.
and never could put into words. And I
Hmm.
know a lot of Orthodox people who would say the exact same thing when it comes to theosis. So like
Hmm.
theosis, I think, is a really important aspect for a lot of people who become Orthodox is that vision of salvation is different. It's one that people can get on board with,
Hmm.
in a way, and doesn't paint God in the same troubling picture that it can. It's easier
Hmm.
for people to swallow, and I think it gives people because some of the stuff there's such a distinction between sort of like justification and sanctification, and there's
Hmm.
such a distinction that it's almost like it's hard to like make the connection between them,
Yep. Yep.
and you don't have that problem, right?
Yep.
So I think that's really because people want to be like, okay, here's this story of salvation. Well, how do I mimic it? How do I imitate it? How do I live it out? Right. And
Yep.
if I can't live it out very easily, it's hard to believe things you can't live out.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
So I would say that was also a big part of it, you
That
know?
makes real sense. That makes real sense. I could very much understand that. Just in terms of looking at when people, we use this word deconstruct, which probably isn't the best word, but when people give up the faith, let's say, or renounce the faith or abandon the faith, um, often I can see that even if they can't articulate it, there's, I one of the things that I'm always sort of back and forth with John Vervaeke about is his complete dismissal of two worlds mythology. But I think a lot of that is behind this, where I think part of what happened in the conversations that emerged in the Protestant Reformation was a reduction. I saw this early on years ago, a reduction of the gospel into hell avoidance.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
if you look at sort of what's happening in the late medieval Roman Catholic Church and in some of those places where the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation does break out, um, it's not hard to understand. Just even looking at, let's say, Martin Luther's life, it's not hard to see how this the the threat of perdition is used as it's basically used as a cudgel
Yeah.
to herd the sheep in so many ways that seem really unintelligible to that particular drama, that at some point people are like, are you really going to tell me that failure to do this will result in eternal damnation? Or
Yeah, people
as,
just stop buying the story. And then when
yeah,
people do give it up, they're like, you know what? I'm just going to try to give it up for a bit and see what happens.
yeah,
And they
yeah,
do, and they have an overwhelming flood of relief,
yes,
a sense of freedom. Like, oh,
yep,
I didn't realize the dark cloud this was putting over my whole life. And so you can very well understand that, you know.
yep,
So,
yep,
for example, so like I don't know if I told you this or not, but like I am writing my dissertation right now at Fordham,
yep.
and I'm doing it on atonement and deification, right? So atonement and theosis. So working through all of that. And the very practical concerns are very much the stuff we've already talked about because like I see atonement. I mean, it can mean a lot of different things, but I mean, what it means popular to almost everybody, say in an American context, I would say it's just a bad story, right? And there's a number of ways you can measure that. It's like it lacks some coherence. It doesn't give a robust enough sense of meaning. It doesn't act as a map for people's lives, right? You can go on and on about this. There's questions about like, well, how does it relate to the principal texts of like the atonement, which is like the passion narratives and the Exodus narrative that it's founded on? And it's like seems way out in left field, right? So I'm hoping, I figure, well, the best way to get rid of a bad story is you got to tell a better one, right? And one that actually helps people sort of like gives them a map to live a life, some sort of map of redemption and to atone for things in some way. So that's sort of like, so even my dissertation stuff comes out of like my own original concerns and interests in my own conversion, right? So
That makes perfect sense. That makes really good sense. It also makes sense of let's see, the emergent movement, which is also happening about the time you go to Orthodoxy. And
yeah, see,
because,
I've heard some of your videos, and I sort of missed a lot of that.
yeah,
I heard about it, but more from sort of like third person perspective,
yeah,
right?
yeah. So the emergent movement is very much dealing with all those same issues, but I think unlike, I think you were fortunate to sort of have this avenue into orthodoxy that could sort of, I sometimes look at orthodoxy, as you said, it's the Marianas Trench, or I always look at the room of requirement in Harry Potter, where orthodoxy, it's like you need something theologically. Well, open up that storeroom because orthodoxy has sort of walked through it all out there, and you can find someone who's dealt with this idea and that idea, and Neoplatonism, they got a whole section on Neoplatonism back there, and just all over the place. And I think um, a lot of what happened with the emergent movement is that they didn't sort of have that storehouse for a lot of people. And so basically they just sort of, as what happened in modernism, they sort of immanentized the eschaton, and just a whole generation of people just walked away from the faith, which again, you get that initial euphoric relief of, well, I'm not running away from the shepherd who's chasing me with the cudgel of eternal conscious torment anymore. And so, wow, all I had to do was just stop going there on Sunday morning and stop hanging out with those kind of people and stop listening to that music and those messages. And now I can just go to Starbucks on Sunday morning.
Yeah.
But then other things are going to come up in life
Yeah,
that a
just
shallow
give that time.
hedonism, especially if you embrace it with sort of a, a a materialist naturalism, I think for a lot of people is eventually going to wind up in some sort of meaning crisis where
Yeah.
far deeper questions eventually seep up, and they realize that, okay, so no, you're no longer sort of running away from the fear of eternal damnation, but there's a whole lot of other things that practice of religion was actually affording you, in your real life and even in the secular frame, that you've also given up. And so now, what are you going to do with those things? And then people go off on the
It's sort of
search.
like the the boost in well-being and happiness that someone can get, like for initially, and maybe for quite a long period of time from like leaving the faith. uh, if you don't have enough robust sort of source of meaning or a meaning framework for that to rest in, it's like the happiness turns to ash in your mouth, and
Mm.
that does eventually happen, to people. I would say, like, you're talking about the whole kludgeon of, like, eternal damnation. That is also one of the things that was a real point of attraction for me, that actually made me believe more, was that orthodoxy is, I would say, more open and far more accepting of universalism,
Oh yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And we should say there's different types. This is like the
Yep.
patristic sort of
Yep.
apokatastasis sort of, there's not a hell, right?
Right.
It's just not like unreasonable. Um, and that was like, that made me, like, it's funny, that made me believe more. And that's been my experience with a lot of people who run into it, is they're like, oh, this is like part of a tradition, right? I mean, I would say it's definitely like, um, there's not any sort of official proclamation on something like this, like one
Right.
way or the other. It just sort of
Right.
sits out there in sort of non-dogmatic land.
Yep.
Um, but what I've seen over and over again is when people run into that, it actually increases their faith and obedience and
Mm.
compliance, not the other way around, which is what you kind of, I think, is the fear for a lot of people who are like, well, if people don't go
Yeah.
to hell, then no one's going to act good, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
And there's a bunch of problems with that. Like, what do you, is it just like for a reward or something? Is that the kind of love? Like, it raises all these problematic questions, but I think at the heart of it, it's a fear that people aren't going to be held accountable and that people aren't going to believe. And I've seen in some ways actually the opposite, right? That you can actually get a lot better compliance, right? If people have something high they're aiming towards,
Yep. Yep.
not just something low they're running away from.
Yep.
And so some people are sort of like are on a spiritual journey and they're feeling it out. And they, like, we get a lot of people who come from deep, like faith deconstruction places, right? Their
Yep.
faith has been deconstructed, and then Orthodoxy is their attempt to sort of maybe like, well, maybe I'll try this weird thing that's totally outside the box as a way to revive it. Or sometimes Orthodoxy is the last stop on the train line before they hop off Christianity altogether.
Yeah. Yeah.
And Universalism can sometimes be this sort of like one point of many that sort of makes them be like, oh, I can believe that.
Yeah.
And then they're able to get on board with that.
Yeah. No, and
Um,
that's what I've seen very much in sort of the corner, and you know what I mean by that.
yeah.
Um, because the universalism, it's so interesting because if there's two topics that if someone just mentions it in the corner, there's just this the whole room is energized. One of them is universalism, and the other is the Trinity. And it's so interesting how these two issues just sort of the air just gets charged, like, in the moments before a thunderstorm, you can just smell the ozone and feel the charge. Um, and it's
That's interesting. That's
well,
interesting.
and universalism, just recently I did a live stream, and Len Vanderzee, who is he's been one of the most influential formative ministers in the Christian Reformed Church for an entire generation, especially for a certain segment of the Christian Reformed Church. I mean, he's recently just sort of gone out there as a Calvinist universalist, and he's looking at church fathers and all of that. I tend to think that the the I think the long term, the threat of hell, while in my opinion biblical, um, doesn't function psychologically with our current generations. Certainly, as the late medievals had and early moderns had hoped it would function in terms of compliance, and that I think people today have a real understanding that obedience obedience achieved purely on the basis of threat is not the kind of obedience that actually many people appreciate. And
Yeah,
and I think I could
it's just
talk
not
about
it's not as robust, as people would hope or like it to be,
well, the minute God's watching eyes are turned, that's always the problem with sort of threat-based compliance is that the moment the threat is gone, so is the compliance. And what you really want to do in formation is, I have adult children. To the degree that my adult children would honor me or even obey me if I asked for it, if the basis of that obedience was threat, I don't want that. I want the basis of that obedience being love, not
Yeah.
threat.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, and so this is this whole thing. This is important. This is partly why I became Orthodox, just sort
Yeah.
of working through this. And I think the Orthodox just had a bit of a better take on it, right? That I could get on. So I teach like an intro to religion and theology course at Fordham, right? And one of the texts I have them read is The Life of Moses by Gregory of Nyssa, right?
Yep.
Just an example of sort of symbolic interpretations. But at the very end of the book, I'm going to read you the short paragraph because I think you'll love it. I almost tear up every time I read it because it really gets to me. But it gets at this whole rewards and punishment thing, right?
Yep.
So I
Yep.
think you'll like this. It goes, since the goal of the virtuous way of life was the very thing we have been seeking, and this goal has been found in what we have said, it is time for you, noble friend, to look to that example and by transferring to your own life what is contemplated through spiritual interpretation of the things spoken literally, to be known by God and to become his friend.
Mhm.
This is true perfection, not to avoid a wicked life because, like slaves, we servilely fear punishment, nor to do good because we hope for rewards, as if cashing in on the virtuous life by some business-like and contractual arrangement. On the contrary, disregarding all those things for which we hope and which we have been reserved by promise, we regard falling from God's friendship as the only thing dreadful and we consider becoming God's friend the only thing worthy of honor and desire. This is the perfect life.
Yes. Yes.
It's
Yes.
just so good, you
Yes.
know. I just I'm like, yeah, more of that,
Well,
you know.
and I think that's completely biblical. I mean,
Yeah,
when you
yeah,
look
yes.
at these moments when Jesus is warning people or relating people to, relating the threat that they are facing, it's always in relational terms. It's depart from me, I never knew you.
Yeah.
And that then is the fear. And I think someone like C.S. Lewis, you can see him really wrestling with those issues in something like The Great Divorce,
Yeah.
because on one hand, and I think this is an area that probably as Orthodoxy becomes a much um, more a much larger conversation partner in Christianity in America, these issues are going to come up. That there are a lot of oh gosh, there are a lot of situations in life where um, understanding what punishment is and isn't,
Mm.
especially if it's not sort of fully agentic. So one of the things, of course, that I played around with on my channel was sort of God number one and God number two. And I was playing with John Vervaeke's agent arena relationship. So God number one is sort of arenic, and God number two is sort of agentic. And there's not two gods, it's one God. And this distinction I got from, well, actually, I started working with it before that, but Ezekiel Kaufman is an early 20th century Jewish scholar who wrote a book called, I forget the name of the book, The Religion of Israel, and where he basically pulls out the difference between, let's say, the religion found in the Bible in the Old Testament, which is very peculiar in the ancient world, because the ancient world sort of distilled pretty much every other religion sort of imagines this metadivine realm, this impersonal metadivine realm in which there are gods that they're functioning, and those gods sort of get, transmitted down to human level in various forms and manifestations. And the thing that he noted is that for the religion of Israel, there's no arena above God, which 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 gives sort of God this arenic quality. And so when you read, let's say, the promises and punishments are super salient in, let's say, the book of Deuteronomy, where it's almost just that stark in the book of Deuteronomy. Here is the covenant, fulfill the covenant and you will live, and all life looks like all of this flourishing. Break the covenant and you will die, and life looks like all this tragedy. Um, to what degree is that agentic and Arenic in
Mm.
that and I think Lewis tries to get at that in The Great Divorce, and I think as the church continues to process this conversation about lostness, perdition, and all of those issues, and how they sort of finally break down in us, and how they get, I think the church is going to continue to chew on that. And the part of the beauty of Orthodoxy is that they have this room and they open it up, and it's like, here, read this guy, how about him, how about him, and you can find, you've got some who will, you've got a portion just like that from Gregory of Nyssa. And then you've got others who are just breathing fire and
Yeah, yeah.
damnation out there, and they're both there, and so they both sit in front of us, and now it's like, okay, we've got both of these. What are we going to do with this? How are we going to process this? And especially when you're working in a local church with individual people, all who have particular and unique backgrounds, and they come to you in a moment in time, and it's okay, how do I apply all of this to you now? Which
Yeah.
which to me
Yeah.
is just the
Yeah, I know. And it is. And in the Orthodox tradition, sort of with the heavy emphasis on the priest as spiritual like the whole like spiritual father aspect, which is really heavy there. That's where I mean, that's sort of where the rubber meets the road of like, all this theology, like, will all this work to get this person to a better place? And it's like, do I need to be more lenient with this person, more gentle? Do I need to be more harsh and draw a line? Right? It reminds me of a story that I didn't hear this. My wife did, from my youngest son, who's 10, and overheard him talking to his other friends. He goes, "Oh, like George's dad is a real dad." And she goes, "What does that mean?" And he goes, "Oh, he's scary and yells." Right? And all the boys were sort of like, yes, there's a degree to which it was like, even little boys, even though they're sort of like, they don't like to get in trouble, they don't like to get yelled at. There's a sense of like, if you're too nice as a dad, you're not a real dad. Like, there's a lack of respect. Like, you have to be sort of like Aslan, good but scary, right?
Hmm.
Um, so there's something there, I think, instinctually, of like a balance between God's harshness and his gentleness. And that balance has to be worked out with our understanding of, say, like eschatological issues like hell or even punishment in this own life. This has to be worked out, because just rushing to one side or the other, right? Either it's like hellfire and brimstone, or sort of some sort of like super, I don't know, like um, Mr. Rogers neighborhood type God,
Right.
right? Nothing against Mr. Rogers. I really love and respect him, but like, but that kind of an image, like, I don't think either of those are going to work. Um,
The Jonathan Edwards, I got this from Tim Keller. Jonathan Edwards talked about these diverse excellencies and how the amazing thing about Jesus is that he's both more demanding than we think is reasonable
mhm.
and more forgiving than we think is responsible.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. It really is. See, that's what every time, this is why even when people lose faith in the church, people often won't lose faith in some connection with Jesus, because Jesus as a person is just compelling,
Yes,
right?
yes.
You run into it and you're like, who who even is this? Right? Like, he breaks all frames, right? Constantly. Yeah, and so
Well, and I think,
that's why I love
part of
Christianity.
what's
But
interesting right now in terms of, I mean, I have, even as a Protestant, sort of a front row seat of a little bit of sort of this Orthodox wave that's happening in America. And what's so interesting is that, see, part of my thinking about Jesus is we as individuals, I can't manage that diverse excellency that Jesus can, because I'm not Jesus. And as much as, the Holy Spirit's working in me and I'm, trying to grow up and be like Jesus, et cetera, et cetera, I don't got the range of Jesus. And let's say somebody who's just mean on one hand and then dismissive on the other hand, they're not compelling at all. They're just, but Jesus manages to do it with integrity, where you actually see the range. But then when you think about Christ as the church as the body of Christ, you see that range in the church, but
yeah, yeah.
but then the church,
That's the right way to think about it.
yeah,
That's the right way to think about it, right? Is that it's like together the whole church makes up the icon of Christ, right?
yep,
It's
yep,
just like this, like the image of God. The image of God isn't this is something Orthodox theologian Sergei Bulgakov sort of pushes at in one of his books called the Bride of the or no, the Lamb of God. And it's that the image of God is only fully sort of realized in a human person when the male and female are brought together, right? It's that male and female together constitute the image of God.
yep,
So in some sense, like, my gender, right, is like, as a male, is like, it's incomplete, right?
yep,
In terms of the image of God, right? And even other church fathers like Maximus get into this, and they're just like, this is why all the divisions in the Genesis story, where God's constantly dividing things to create identity, the identities and divisions are then brought back into harmony and in some
yep.
sort of unity, that is unity without compromising the integrity of identity, right? And so it's a very similar idea, right?
And that's why although it's frustrating and can be kind of chaotic and sometimes even destructive, I look at both of these sort of it's not just in the Orthodox Church, Protestant churches too. I mean, all this stuff just gets manifested out there. You have sort of the Universalist wing out there, and people are, but these people are worried. Then you have the hardliners over here, and what's so interesting in this Orthodox moment is that on one hand, sort of you have the Ortho bros that are all we're masculine, we're hardline, we're, take no prisoners. Boy, if you're not fasting from just about everything conceivable fastable during Lent, I've got no place in you. And then you've got the other Orthodox that are over on the other side, and they're like, they're they're reading Bulgakov, and they're Universalist, and they're, just enjoying
Yeah, yeah,
everything.
yeah. But and it's nice to be able to have a tradition that's um able to hold together some amount of diversity, partly just because people are so different. Like in my parish, like I mean, I guess we'd be considered more conservative for New York, for Manhattan, but I mean that's not saying much for the rest of the country. But there's a good amount. I mean, there's a good amount of political diversity. I have people who are on like very, very wide ends of the spectrum. But I think that's sort of a litmus test for a community. Like, can you have that kind of sort of political or cultural diversity and still like hold your unity and your love
Yes,
together?
yes,
That's a great
yes.
test. And part of like that's the trial of salvation and loving each other. It's like you got
Yeah.
to figure out how to do that, right?
Well, and not
But you're
just and
kind of not
not
allowed to
just
fail at it.
and not just say nice things about each other, but still be a cohesive thing.
Yes.
We are okay. We have diversity in this church, political diversity and diversity on a number of other things, but people can still see us and say they're a church, they're a body. There's a union there, and that union is meaningful and powerful and compelling, and something that not only people outside but even people inside continue to aspire to embody and to create amongst themselves. And
Yeah.
I think that's part of the challenge of it's always part of the challenge of Lord of sort of the big C church, where we're all sort of claiming Jesus and praying that Jesus is claiming us. And but that's always sort of how we're trying to embody Christ now as his body in this place, in this time, in this culture, with all of those particularities.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well,
So anyways, it's going to be like a challenge for us is with all these, like, you talked about all these younger people coming in.
yeah,
This wave of converts is a good bit different from what I experienced and what like my cohort went through. I mean, Orthodoxy has had a series of like waves of converts, like waves of immigration since like the mid 70s, right? Or early 70s, which is kind of when English started being used. Like if you went to Orthodox Church in the 1960s, like there would be nothing in English anywhere, right? There was like one book written by Timothy Ware, right? In 1970. So it's been a pretty radical transformation, like in the US, Orthodox has gone through over the past 50 years. Um, and so this wave is very different. It's a very unchurched wave. And so it's great to have like 12, 15 catechumens, right? Like we do in our parish, but that's a ton more work for me to sort of form people. Like I talked a little bit with this about at ARC, like a couple of my rules, like I make people they have to be a catechumen for a year. They have to basically show that they can stick around and that they really want to do this. Um, People have to actually demonstrate that they're involved and engaged. They have to actually belong to the community, right? And so
yeah,
there's something belonging actually will precede the conversion,
yes,
right? So and this stuff just takes a lot of work. And you have people who they don't have, there's all these things, you and I growing up, like take for granted growing up in very religious households and religious communities. A lot of people have none of this. And so there's a lot of, you're like pouring foundations for people. Uh, and so it's exciting and fun and challenging, but it's a lot of work too. And there's a lot of risk that it won't be done right. Right. In the same way, like I have an old house. Our house is like 120 years old. So whenever we fix something, we just expect that there's going to be more to fix. Like you pull out, like, oh, look at this wiring job. House hasn't burned down yet. Thank God, right? And so you run into that stuff. But see, that's what's going to happen to us if we don't do a good job with this, because it's happening at a scale and a pace that is actually very challenging to keep up with.
Yeah, yeah.
Right. And so yeah, there's just a high risk for sort of for miscarriage, you know?
Talk to me about your transition from um, Orthodox member into becoming an Orthodox priest. What was that like for
Oh,
you?
yeah. Okay. So I was on track for ordination in the Methodist Church. And so when I converted, I had to have some uncomfortable conversations, which went fine. I did not have bad experiences leaving the Methodist Church,
Yeah,
right? And I did not have a real, like some people do from the traditions they come. I did not have a real bad attitude towards my past.
yeah,
I had a
yeah,
pretty healthy, positive past, and I didn't become Orthodox because I had so many problems with and complaints and or any sort of trauma or something from my past. I became, because I, in some ways, I just saw it as, oh, this is just the next step of me further pursuing my relationship with Christ and working out what it means to be a Christian, and what the church means, and tradition, just working that out. So I converted and then graduated shortly after. I also got married in college too. I got married very young. I got married when I
Oh,
was 20, right?
wow.
Yes. So yeah, so like I'm 42 and my oldest son is 18, right? Um, and so I got married, yeah, in college, and that's why I said a lot of stuff happened in college, right? It was like
Yeah, yeah.
attended a church, and then got married, and then became Orthodox, and then graduated, and then I basically just hung around because I made the decision that if Orthodoxy was really true, right? If I thought it was really true, then that should be then my vocation should be a worthy sacrifice for the truth. So I decided then maybe I'd be an Orthodox priest, maybe I wouldn't, but I decided that I was not going to convert with that sort of like string attached, right? It had to be like free. And then I would just work out as I went along if that was a thing. So I spent maybe 5 years, sort of in the parish, and kind of worked, just started taking on more and more leadership, more and more
Yep,
responsibility, and
yep.
taught church, taught Sunday school, and served on the parish council, and, was eventually tonsured a reader, and, all these things. Um, so that was my experience after college, was that. And I worked at Goodwill Industries. I did like basically like social work type stuff. And I ran a program for a while working with felons, guys who are on parole. So I did a vocational rehab program, did this work job placement with
Hmm.
guys, had a couple guys threatened to, I have so many great stories from this time with those guys. But
Those
that
kind
was
of jobs give you great stories.
yeah, no, it was good preparation. Like, for example, one of the rules that I have for my catechumens comes from uh, basically parole policies that I learned about during that time,
Hmm.
which is they don't let, like in parole, you're not allowed to have develop new romantic relationships of any kind, right? Because it almost like 100%, almost 100% means the person will go back to prison.
Yeah,
Like they'll violate their parole in
yeah,
some way, the
yeah,
rules.
yeah,
And the reasons for that are the same reasons I tell people, just put any big new romantic relationships, just put on the back burner, just put it on hold. And then when you're done, you can pick that back up. Just don't do too many huge life changes. Part of it's just that. Just don't be stupid. Don't do too much at once.
yeah,
You know,
yeah,
like focus.
yeah,
Um, this is a big deal. Are you going to do this for the rest of your life, or is this a fad? I'm not going to let it be a fad. So if you want to do it, let's do it right.
yeah.
So it came from that, and I did that for it. And then eventually, went through a discernment process, trying to figure out, is this what I really want to do? And talked to my parish priest about that. And, and I will say this, I think one of the best look, okay, a couple of things. When people talk about a calling, I think it's almost always understood a sense of like a personal inward calling. And I think that's definitely a part of it. But the other dimension to a calling is that the community calls you,
Hmm.
right? That they
Hmm.
call you out. And I
Hmm.
think this gets ignored and forgotten a lot, right? That it's like,
Hmm.
well, how does God speak to you? Well, God does speak to you through other people for the most
Hmm.
part.
Mm-hmm.
So, if the church is calling you, then that's God calling you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I found myself, slowly as a layman, taking on more and more responsibilities and ministries and duties that were more and more like being a clergyman.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so, like,
Mm-hmm.
that, I think, is a natural way. It's like you're looking at a parish or community who should be going onwards to serve. It's like, well, what are people already doing? Right?
Yep.
Like, are
Yep.
you really going to be something different than what you're not doing now when you have the opportunity to do it? And it's like, probably not. So I discerned that. And part of that was meeting with Father Roman Braga, who is a Romanian um, priest monk who served a women's monastery that was maybe like 10 minutes from my house where I grew up in Michigan. Um, he was a really holy man. He's one of these people talk about in the church of like, oh, maybe he'll be made a saint one day. So he's one of these people that's like potential saint type material. He was really influential in my mentor we talked about from college, who became my godfather, right? When I was brought
Mm-hmm.
into the church, he was really instrumental in him becoming Orthodox. And Father Roman was known for having sort of the gift of clairvoyance, like knowing things about your life and stuff that
Mm-hmm.
you couldn't.
Yep.
How would you know this?
Yep.
Godfather had a pretty profound experience of that in his
Mm-hmm.
conversion process. And so I was regularly at the monastery, which when we were really young, we had young kids. My oldest son, who's 18 now, when he was real little, he was maybe like 6. He always called it the monastery, which all the nuns thought was hilarious, right? They liked it. And so, yeah. Father Roman was great. I don't think I've told very many people this story, but I went and met with him to have a discussion, like a real formal kind of discussion about discerning to go to seminary and be a priest. And we talked, and the most profound thing he said and left me with was he goes, look, Matthew, God is not going to come down in a giant cloud of light and speak to you in some message. He goes, um, God has already given you everything you need. He's giving you the people around you, He's giving you your good judgment and reason. And so you need to do that. And you should not wait around for
Mm,
some sign,
mm,
because doing that is being wasteful of what you've already been given,
mm-hmm,
what's already been revealed to you, and a bit egotistical,
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
and it was just real practical, solid advice
Yeah.
from someone who was in many ways a real mystic. He suffered really profoundly in the Romanian gulags, right?
Mm,
I mean, there some of the most, I mean, forms of torture, psychological experimentation that you couldn't even talk about you couldn't even say it out
yeah.
loud, like
Yeah.
kind of stuff. Um,
Yeah.
and so you have someone like that just giving you such down to earth, practical
Yeah.
advice too.
Yeah.
It was good. It was a good reminder. It's like, yeah, yeah, that's right. And sometimes you already know what you're supposed to do. You're just sort of looking for someone else to give you a thumbs up, right? You're just
Mm-hmm.
sort of like,
Mm-hmm.
okay, I'm looking for someone to tell me no. Someone tell me
Mm-hmm.
not do this. And so
Yep.
that's, I think, what I was doing in that situation was like, I need to do due diligence and make sure I'm not being a fool, in
Yep.
the process.
So where were you a priest first?
New Jersey.
Okay.
So when I went to seminary, I was from the Midwest. So typically you return to the diocese you were sent from for the most
Mm.
part.
Oh, really?
Yeah, there is some transference that goes around, but it's kind of difficult because it's so relationship based with bishops. Like, I've been like the secretary of our diocese for a number of years. And so I've been helping the bishop out with stuff. We always get like letters of petition for people to come into the diocese, priests out there looking for places.
Hmm.
Get a lot of priests from like uh the old world sometimes who are looking to come to America and stuff like that. And he's like, Bishop's always like, I don't know this person. They're like, put them in a file. Like, it's like because he would never put someone somewhere that he doesn't know. Right. Like the level of personal relationship is just it really matters. Right.
Yep. Yep.
Um, and so unless there's some credible need and the person comes with a lot of like other recommendations and other stuff that, yeah. So it happens, like, especially if it's like, oh, I need to move to be with my aging parents, help take care of them or whatever. Like there's like a lot of times family needs
Hmm.
will really drive people sort of going across the country to different dioceses, but it's not typical. So when I was in seminary, we had a glut of seminarians from our diocese of the Midwest. So it was like there were no openings. There weren't any openings kind of coming for around the bend. And there were like, I was in seminary with like 8 or 10 other guys from the Midwest. And there were like 4 or 5 guys from previous years who had graduated who were kind of waiting around to get ordained in an assignment. So I decided, you know what, I should be smart here, and I hitched my wagon to another bishop, who was he taught at the seminary. He was from New York, and I've always had sort of a draw towards more urban ministry
Hmm.
in
Hmm.
urban settings. So then I just hitched my wagon to him, and so my first parish for 8 years was in New Jersey, sort of like in from New Jersey. Well, yeah, you would know it's from Bergen County.
Yep.
So it was in a the church was in a town called Saddlebrook,
Yep.
and I lived and still live in a house we have in Glen Rock, which
Yep.
is a couple towns north of there. So
Which is very much where, where I grew up. Glen Rock is a little suburb out there and not far from Patterson. And yeah, a lot of, kids I went to Christian school with lived in Glen Rock, Wyckoff, Midland Park. Midland Park was, when I was growing up, there was a massive Christian Reformed church in Midland Park. Now they're a fraction of what they were when I was growing up. So,
and isn't there like a reformed like Eastern Christian school or something? That's like a reformed,
yeah, yeah, yeah. That was the
right?
school I went K through 12 in, Eastern Christian
So
School.
funny.
Yeah, yeah.
So funny. Huh.
It's so funny. If you look up Eastern Christian in Wikipedia and you look at notable alumni, the first one mentioned is Peter Kreeft, who grew up in the Reformed
Oh,
Church of America, went to Eastern Christian, went to Calvin College, then became Roman Catholic, breaking everybody's hearts
yeah.
along the way.
I read his book in college. Was it something pagans, modern pagans, or
Oh,
what
he's
was?
got tons. Kreeft has written more books than I can read. But and then all the rest of them are Um, like the Jonas Brothers went there. All of these teen entertainers, somehow this little Christian school association that I went to, which was mostly full of Dutch kids from the Christian Reformed Church, um, somehow people wanted became sort of a frilly private school that people who didn't want to send their kids to public school would pay the tuition to go to.
That's
So
funny.
so I'm not a notable alumnus of Eastern Christian, even though
Well, maybe
none of the
I'll
notable
try to
alumnus
worm
are.
my way into the Wikipedia world, see if I can get something changed on there.
Yeah,
But
that's true.
that's
So yeah,
funny.
so no, I know that whole area. Um, but now you are pastoring in Manhattan.
Yeah, that's right. So when I decided that I was going to start my PhD program, which like I always like I did very well in seminary, right? And I'll often had people say, "Oh, you should do more studies and more of this," and so and I did, and partly I had questions and theological stuff I wanted to work through. And so at some point you're sort of like, man, if people keep telling you to do something, maybe you should sort of like take it seriously. And I'm a bit of an ambitious person, so I like oh, I'll do more, you know. So like I'm kind of like that. Um, so I did, and when I made that move and got accepted there, I decided that was a good time to change parishes. I was also concerned because the parish we were at had like basically no children, and I was getting worried. Not so much about my eldest son, but my eldest son is pretty severely, disabled. He's got some pretty big
Mm,
disabilities, um, but he loves church, and he's always serving in the altar, and so like church is like wonderful for him. It doesn't matter if there were any kids there at church or not. But my daughter growing up, sort of coming into like middle school and soon to high school, I was more concerned about, of like, man, I don't want to give her like I had such a good experience as a teen. And I thought, man, I was just feeling sort of like I'm going to feel guilty. I'm going to feel like I really failed if
mm,
I had such a great experience like that as a kid and I was not able to give that to my own daughter.
mm.
I don't know that kind of stuff as a parent kind of hurts. You're sort
Yeah.
of just like you don't want to do that. So I also thought, switching parishes might be good. Anyways, I've been there for 8 years, and I had sort of felt like maybe I'd done everything I could do for that parish. Maybe someone else could do
Yeah.
other things.
Yeah.
This parish had some more children. It had some more potential to grow. So I was like, okay, I'll make that switch, which I did. Now this parish, and we're in the upper west side of Manhattan, so we're like a couple blocks south of Columbia University, and just like 2 blocks away from the from Central Park. Now I got here on the heels of basically a scandal. So they had like in 2018-19, there was this big scandal, sexual misconduct scandal in the parish with the previous rector, the previous priest. And then COVID hit right after that. So it was like 1-2 punch, to the parish. When I got assigned here, the bishop, well, first of all, the bishop was able to find a wealthy family to basically fund my entire salary, right, for a number of years out. And when I got to this parish, there were like 10 people and like no money in the bank account. Now, like on like the past couple of Sundays, we've had like 70 people or something like that. And so this was maybe like 3 years. I've been here for 3 years. And huge chunk of these people are all new. They're all very young. And which is great, but there's still enough older people in the parish that it's a good dynamic.
You want that.
So I've been here. I didn't sort of expect. I kind of took this church and thought, oh, well, this won't be a lot of work because I'm doing my PhD. Is that the way like to trick God into like making you successful, right? Is be like, I'll do this thing and it won't work, so I can do other things or something. And then it starts to like explode, and I'm like, oh, okay, more problems. All right. I mean, they're good problems. That's one of my words of wisdom is like, you don't want no problems. You want to aim for having the best problems in your life.
Yeah. So. What's it like moving churches? Because in the Christian Reformed Church, I've gotten 2 letters in 2 weeks from other churches that, they're having a search process and they'd like to know if I'd be willing to, let my name stand in their search process, yada, yada, yada. But you've got a bishop system. So what is that like in the Orthodox Church?
So the different jurisdictions, it differs a little bit, right? So like the OCA is not as militaristic in the way it operates like this, but like say the Antiochians, which are like the Arab Christians, and then like the Greeks, it's a lot more like, oh, the bishop says, hey, you're going to go here, right? So it's a lot more of like a real, more of an appointment system. In the OCA, well, see, like the Greeks can do that more because the Greeks have more money. So part of it is like if you pay somebody enough, you can sort of tell them to do more things. Here, it's sort of like a lot of OCA priests don't get paid well. Like in Alaska, our Alaska diocese, which is like almost entirely just a Native peoples diocese, which has like a treaty. Just people are like, our diocese has like a Native peoples treaty with the federal government. Sort of treated like in a semi-tribal status, right? It was given, the federal government gave all this land to the diocese, mostly because it was like stolen from the Native people. So it was like a way to sort of like give some of it back. Anyways, but most of those priests there, like they live under the federal poverty line. Almost all the priests in that diocese. That's way more extreme than the lower 48. But nevertheless, it's hard to just give people marching orders when they don't have very much money. You're not paying them a whole lot. So the way it kind of works, like I'll tell you how it kind of works in our diocese is the bishop will be like, look, he'll email priests, I have these openings, these things are coming up down. If anyone wants to transfer or move, he won't even say like what the opening is. He'll just say anybody who's interested in moving, like reach out to me. Right. And then there's those conversations that happen. So it's sort of like a conversation. There's sort of like a symbiotic relationship of sort of like, oh, what do you want? What do you need? You move, sometimes like we had like one priest that was like down in southern part of New Jersey, moved up to like more parts of like northern New York State to be closer to like his wife's parents to help them. So like those kind of moves happen, but priests do tend to stay in a parish for a very long time, sometimes like 30, 40 years. They'll be there for a long time. There's pluses and minuses to sort of long tenures and short tenures. You just have to sort of pick your poison
Yeah.
with a lot of that. And so for me, I just told him, I was like, hey, I'd be interested. And I knew that there was an opening here at Mary Magdalene. I said, hey, I'd open into moving to a different parish like Mary Magdalene that would work for the PhD stuff. And I was in conversation with my bishop about the PhD process, right? Which one of the reasons wanted to do that too is that in seminary, the most ideal professor is the one who is like a priest and has pastoral experience and is an academic.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
there's not a lot of that,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Um, and so you get sort of these either or worlds, and um, sometimes they can be not as beneficial or helpful as sort of the student needs, right, in seminary.
Yeah.
But hey, maybe I can help, serve in that way, you know. Um,
So, I paid a lot of attention to Tim Keller and Redeemer Press. They were sort of an anomaly in New York City in that it was a conservative Presbyterian church that was also a mega church in New York City with a rather exceptional pastor. And of course, Tim Keller, when he retired, the church sort of split into different smaller churches. And what are you noticing about let's just say the spiritual environment of at least the corner of Manhattan you're in? What kind of things can you tell just by what you're seeing in the city?
yeah, well, I mean, besides the rats and like the dog crap all over the sidewalk, is
Well,
that
that's
oh,
normal.
sorry.
I grew up in Patterson. We had rats and dog crap and the falls
Um,
that Tony
no,
Soprano would throw his
yeah,
people
yeah.
over.
Like, I mean, there's definitely a clear difference that the people who are spiritually interested and sensitive are younger, and people who are older seem to be inoculated,
Hmm.
right? Um, I think that's clear. And the people who are coming and showing up are largely from unchurched backgrounds,
Hmm.
right? I had one guy came and he's here seeking. I baptized him like a year ago, and that's the thing too. A lot more baptism. See, we don't rebaptize people if they had a Trinitarian baptism, right?
Okay.
It's like a
Yeah.
legit baptism. So it's
Right.
only if it was like they were like a Jehovah's Witness or a Mormon or something that's sort of like clearly non-Trinitarian.
Right.
Would we do that? So we did a lot more chrismations, which is like the Eastern version of confirmation.
Yep.
Um, we do a lot more baptisms now, right, of people because they didn't have any like church background or weren't baptized. And this one kid came in, uh, and he was just sort of like, I don't think he even fully knew what he was looking for or seeking, right? But
Yeah.
that's how seeking goes.
Yeah.
And so he's sort of like trying to figure his life out, which I think is actually admirable. I see a lot of these young men, and I think what they're trying to do is they're just trying to man up. They're trying to like grow up,
Yep.
put their life in order,
Yep.
and live well because the way they see the models around them, they don't like.
Yep.
And
Yep.
so he shows up and he doesn't even know if he believes in God. He doesn't even really believe in God, right? So that's the thing too, is you're getting people who are interested, who are interested in the church and don't yet believe in God, right? And you're like, this is kind of new, right? And then there was one liturgy he was in, and this was maybe his like he had been maybe coming for a month, and I remember someone asked him, and I was right next by, and he goes, "Oh, so like, how was service today?" He's like, "Well, I'm just trying to get my head around the fact that uh, God's real." Like he had an experience in the like a charismatic experience in the liturgy
Yep.
where the like faith just gripped him, right, in a moment, and he was like, "Oh, God's real. I believe in him." Almost like it's not like you choose to believe, it's like you find yourself believing, right?
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
that's what happened to him. And so like stories like that are common. I have a couple of very young guys who are like 15. They're like minors, like they're just high school boys, and they're showing up and dragging their parents along, right? And so they're like
Wow.
way more religious. Like these two boys, they're both from like Hispanic backgrounds. One's like Dominican and one's some other background, and they just like show up here, you know, and they've been coming, and and that's a whole nother thing. It's like how do you pastor someone who's a minor like that and who wants to convert and this whole process like that's whole kind of that's a hairy
Yeah.
thing because you got to respect boundaries and all these things. You want to create divisions between the parents and like this is the you know um This is all the really hard stuff with pastoring, right? This kind
Yep.
of stuff, these judgment calls you have to make
Yep.
constantly. And you're making these judgment calls that are having huge impacts in people's lives. And you're like,
Yeah.
God, don't let me screw this up. You know, you're like, you think, man, like reasonable screw ups, right? That you could excuse for someone for making can still wreck someone's life,
Yeah.
right?
Yep. Yep. Yep.
So that's why I say, like, be a shepherd of souls with like real trepidation,
Yeah. Yeah.
you know.
Did
So
you have a building you inherited, or what kind
I
of
did, yeah,
space are
yeah,
you
we
in?
did. We're like in a storefront situation. So we
Oh,
own like
okay.
the first floor, the second floor, and like part of the basement. And
Okay.
so we own that all outright. So like that was and the space itself is beautiful, right? It's
Mm.
it's very small, right? Like, I mean, we're almost certainly going to break like all the fire codes for Pascha, right? For Easter, you know. Yeah, I know. And well, that's what I joke. I go, you're not a real priest until you get the fire marshal shows up at your church. No. Um,
Well,
so
so I have a question with respect to this too, because so I, after we did this big event in Chino with Vervaeke and Peugeot, and then Sunday afternoon we toured Father Josiah Trenum's church in Riverside, big beautiful church.
yeah, yeah.
But part of what's different in Protestant churches, I mean, Protestant churches, it's all about the seating and the parking, and then maybe
Oh yeah, yeah.
the fellowship space. Um, but so I went into his church and it was like, hmm, you guys process people through here differently, because with a Protestant church, it's similar to a theater in that,
Yep.
everybody comes and they parks their car, especially suburban church, let's say New York church, maybe they take the subway, yada, yada. But then they come and you have place for, everyone to sit, and then you do the thing and then they go out. But you guys do you stand? Because you don't seating. So you can, my impression was when I went into his church, boy, I bet he gets away sort of with less square foot per person than
Oh yeah,
Protestants.
absolutely. So let me give my pitch as to why pews are bad.
Oh
Okay.
yeah, I'd love to hear it.
All right, all right. So our parish does not have pews, right? And this, well, one, this fits better with the flow of the Divine Liturgy, right? So this is one way in which um, the Eastern liturgical experience can be different. Even if you come from a non-liturgical experience, sometimes the Western sort of Catholic experience, you're like, is going to be more closer, right, to you. In the Eastern one, there's a lot more fluidity, right?
Hmm.
There's not a clear start and end time as much.
Yeah.
It's There's a lot less of like I'm here as like an observer, right? Or
Yeah.
like I'm watching, like the whole theater type
Yeah.
performance experience is reduced a lot. So not having pews, one, there's a lot more movement. Like the service is very dynamic. There's a lot of times when like you're coming out for these entrances and you're moving and you're processing and you're coming out in the middle of church and then you're coming back into the altar. And so there's all this movement. And so pews get in the way of that, right? That's one. So it just doesn't work with the services very well. And two, especially during Lent, like the time we're in now, people are prostrating and bowing and doing all this stuff and kneeling, and you can't do all these prostrations and stuff with pews in the way. All right, so that is kind of like it. Just functionally, it's problematic for the liturgy. But the other benefit is, well, this is practical. Yeah, you can cram a ton of people in. So when you have like Easter services at midnight, which we do at midnight, and then afterwards we have a big feast, and people usually here partying until like the sun comes up, right? Is usually the way it works. You can fit a bunch of people in there. So when you have huge events, you got to cram everyone in. You can just like sardines, right? So you can do that. The other one is it allows people to come in and out of the service without being as much of a disturbance. And it feels like
Hmm.
you could come late, you could leave early, you could. And so if it's a long service, like say it's like 2 or 3 hours, you might come out, take a break, and then come back in. And it's especially good with children because a child rolling around and playing around in a pew is, as you know, loud and noisy, right? All these wooden pews and everything. If you don't have that, a kid rolling around on like the hardwood floor and you have maybe some like these like nice carpets on it, right? It doesn't make any noise. It's not any. So the same amount of movement is a fraction of the distraction. And so that's really great. I think it's better for young families with kids to be able to feel like you can come in and out of the service. And so one of the things you'll notice is this sort of like clear start time thing is, well, one, people are late. They're not like a lot of Westerners with sort of like time. But when people come in, they often have entrance, I call them entrance rituals. So they'll come in and they'll venerate icons. So it might be like 20 minutes into the service, and a family shows up and they start venerating the icons. They put some money in the alms box. They get candles. They start lighting candles and saying prayers and crossing themselves. And so what you have going on is the liturgy is going on, and at the same time, people are doing their own entrance rituals and saying their own prayers and going through the motions that they do when they come in. And you're like, oh, there's a layering of like prayerful activity. Now, if you have multiple priests, you might have another priest who's off to the side during the liturgy or during like the matins, the morning prayer service beforehand, hearing confessions. So you might have people lighting candles and saying prayers, right, for their like sick mother right in front of the Theotokos Mary icon, real fervently. The priest is chanting and doing the liturgy, and then over here another priest is hearing confessions, and that's all happening at the same time, right? So like that flow fits better with sort of like a much more open space.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of my argument. I mean, I think for Orthodoxy, it just works better. You know, it'd be a huge thing for like some Protestant church to do. It probably wouldn't make sense, to do something like that. People would like, what, pews? I lost my faith if we don't have pews.
It's so funny. So the only Orthodox liturgy I've been to was when I was in Ireland. I went with Paul Kingsnorth and Martin Shaw and Christian Baxter, and it was in sort of the back room of this very intimidating Catholic institution, and they had rows of chairs and they had a sort of a movable kneeling thing. And we first got in there, and like, I'm a big guy, and it's like I wasn't sure quite how I would stand, and it was that would have been much easier with an open space. And what's interesting is that sort of reminds me of, I was in the Dominican Republic for the first 7 years of my ministry as a missionary, and I mean the Dominican services, especially when I would visit, because when I would visit, they would pile on like the baptisms and the weddings. And because even though I'm this low church Protestant, they would treat me like a bishop. It was just in their church DNA.
Yeah.
And even though I did not in no way deserve to be a bishop for any of those people, I was just fresh out of seminary. But, people are always coming and going during the services and, checking in this and checking in that, even though it's so interesting because I wonder what the Haitians would think of an Orthodox service. It's so interesting where you have these movements of people sort of through time in and out of, let's say, these kind of these archetypal fixtures in reality in terms of community, sort of like commonness versus individuation, and image versus sort of theoretical. And you just see the church, as with, questions of perdition and things, you just see the church playing with so many of these very human structures as we're trying to kind of, one of the things that I was hugely blessed by Jonathan Peugeot with was, I guess I had always seen the Bible as diachronic in terms of a very linear Genesis, creation to eschatology thing. And what Peugeot really helped me see was also the Bible is not just diachronic, it's also sort of, this is the picture of reality. It's a little bit more static. And so that's sort of the difference between, let's say, a story about St. Peter versus an icon of St. Peter. You sort of have these two,
it's
the
like the whole
Kairos
story
versus
comes in one
Chronos.
flash, right? And like there
Yes,
it is,
yes,
right?
yes.
Yeah.
So, well, I want to be respectful of your time, and I definitely want to talk again because the truth is, I have so many questions about Orthodoxy, but I often struggle with the right person to ask. But I feel like, I don't know if
Yeah,
it's the New
it's
Jersey
not the Ortho
thing,
Bros, just so you know.
but I feel like I can. I feel like I really click with you on these things, and I really
Yeah, well, I'd be happy to come back and chat more. And I think that does need to happen because people like when we were at the art conference, I had a lot of people come up to me, which I played with my cassock a little bit strategically to
Yeah,
see what people would react to.
yeah.
I did wear it one day
And
and wore
some
it.
people are going to be hugely disappointed. You're not dressed right now. That's going to be a comment that is
Oh,
just
yeah, okay. I should say just so the reason is because I just came from teaching. So like I just was up in the Bronx, taught my class, drove down here to the church in Manhattan because I have some meetings with I have some like pastoral counseling stuff after this with some people.
You mean
And
you don't
so
sleep or shower in that thing? I mean, don't you just
yeah,
wear
yeah,
that
yeah, yeah.
24/7?
I know. Oh no, he's not in all the time. He might actually be human. Oh no, right? So
But I want to give a little bit of space at least for you if you had anything you wanted to bring up or any questions that you had before we land the plane here.
uh no, no, I don't think I do. I don't think I do. But I would be. This was a lovely conversation and or conversation. I gotta say it the Paul Vanderklay way. You know, I'm working on it. But no, I say I'm more than happy to like talk more in the future. Because like I was saying at the Arc, people were very interested in Orthodoxy, had a very positive opinion about it, felt that like it was a they're going to bring something to the table in the conversation that we need. But people were very ignorant. They did not know anything about Orthodoxy. And sometimes, and this is especially true for ARC, people were very open and positive about religion with being basically all neophytes, right? They were just did not know, were not religiously formed hardly at all.
Yeah.
So I think there's definitely, especially in spaces like yours in the corner, places that aren't sort of just like right next to, or even just like immediately adjacent to Orthodoxy, to be able to sort of like open up, sort of like, you know, and explain and talk more sort of about what the faith actually is, you know,
Yeah.
other than just some dude on a chat forum who thinks he knows everything, but is probably in his mother's basement, right? So
Well, and
I'm a little harsh on some of these guys,
yeah,
but
and I have deep love and respect for, Jonathan Peugeot and Richard Rowland, and these guys have taught me so much. But there is you and I this is one thing I always tell people because people are like, well, you're my pastor. I says, I can't be your pastor through the internet. That's not what a pastor is. And part of if the only orthodoxy is Peugeot or Josiah Trenum or Jay Dyer or whatever, whoever's out there in the podcast or YouTube land. I mean, I'm not saying that's disingenuous or wrong or not a thing, but we are sort of behind this glass. And even though
yeah,
stuff is getting transmitted back and forth, one of these years I got to get back to New Jersey. I've never been to a high school reunion. So next time if I ever get to a high school reunion, I definitely want to make your church in Manhattan and visit your church and do that. I definitely want to do that. So,
that'd be great. That'd be great.
well, thank you so much for giving me your time. And I know my goodness, I can't even imagine working on your PhD and 70 people that to a bunch of people that might sound like, well, that's not that a lot of people. It doesn't matter exactly how many people. It matters a world in terms of where they're at. You can have 70 people who've been saints for 50 years, and it's kind of like, yeah, yeah. You got
Yeah, yeah,
70 brand new people and teenagers coming into the church. It's like I can't begin, to actually attend to these people as much as they need. So
yeah.
I hear that. So Matthew, thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, Paul.
It was a pleasure. I will end the recording and yeah. So for those so I have a liturgy. I say hi, this is Paul at the beginning. At the end, I say leave a comment. So there we go. I've done that.